So now let's transition a little bit more now to the emerging franchisor that already has the FDD. And I'm curious on how often do you recommend that a franchisor really take a look at their FDD in crafting it and making changes? And what are some of the more popular changes you see in the emerging franchisor space when they update their FDD?
Well, first of all, I do get a lot of those. And a lot depends on who did their FDD initially.
Right.
And if it's a franchise attorney who's done it before, it's usually fairly decent. But if they go to these, quote, packagers who say, oh, for $40,000, we'll do your FDD, we'll do your ops manual, we'll do everything, it winds up, you have to redo it because they're garbage. And they don't realize it because it's cheap.
Right.
Back in the day, item 19, almost nobody ever did an item 19. Now, last I heard, 60% of franchisors have an item 19. It's become a valuable selling tool. Now, legally, it's not required. The FTC hasn't come out with it, although it's been recommended for years. They've never said you have to have an item 19. So you don't need it. But if you don't have a bunch of franchisees out there who can validate the concept, you should have an item 19 if you have any company-owned stores. It helps the sales process. So I like to take a look at that. We take a look at the franchise agreement, how it was drafted. I like to, compliment lawyers who do a good job. So if they've got a lawyer who's done a good job, then there's not much you have to change.
Sure.
But if it wasn't a lawyer who did it, beware.
Also, it's sometimes on the franchisor side. So I had my initial FDD was actually called the UFOC, as you remember back in the day.
Right.
And I had mine crafted, and it was actually done by a really good franchise attorney. But when I came to you, it was because I had to make changes to my document because I was making changes to my system because truthfully, my company evolved and changed. I mean, even things down to like you and I changed like territory size and minimum royalty amounts. But I was learning as a franchisor, different things along the way. I could pull out my FDD and I can go item by item and say, we did this because this happened. And then I made this change because that happened. It is literally like story. I could take it almost like as a storybook on the changes we made. You mentioned item 19. Now, there might be a lot of people listening that don't know what that is. So share with everyone. Look, we're 15 minutes into the conversation and item 19 already came up and it's the juiciest part of the document. So would you share what that is?
Item 19 is financial performance. So if you have company units, for example, that have been in business for more than a year, you can use the numbers that those stores have done in your document. We call it item 19, so that the buyer, the franchisee, sees the kind of numbers. You can't guarantee that they'll do those numbers, but at least they get a picture of what a store can do. And there are different ways. Some companies just do top line sales. Some do a full P&L, which I don't recommend. Some do gross sales less cost of goods in the restaurant business, for example. If you can do averages, if you have a number of company stores. Now, if you have franchisees, you have to do both. You can't pick and choose. You can't cherry pick, and you can't put the best numbers in and leave the worst numbers out. You got to put them all in. So if you're a system you're already franchising, and you have a few franchisees who've been in business over a year, and you have company stores, you got to put them both in.
Right.
You can't just put company stores in and leave the franchisees out. But item 19 becomes an important tool. And most franchise marketing companies, that do franchise sales, if you don't have an item 19, some of them won't even take you on as a client.
Right. Right. And you're right. When I had started, it was only about 20% of all franchisors that did an item 19.
That's right.
And I heard the same statistic as you, about 60% now do. And it's probably also another reason because this just dramatic increase in franchisors using these outside franchise sales organizations. They need the help, right? They need the data because we all know what's the number one question that a potential franchisee asks is, how much money can I make? And so item 19 sort of answers that question within the legal parameters of however we designed the data, right? And we have to do it in a very clear-cut way that you're right. We can't just discriminately pull out the ones that aren't doing well, but we can be creative. For example, if we have full-time franchise owners versus only part-time franchise owner model, we could show the full-time business model, the full-time franchisees and show the part-time and say, here's why you want to do it full-time. So like you said, you are using it as a sales tool, but it's all within the legal framework. And that's the beauty of having an experienced franchise attorney such as yourself, because as the entrepreneur, I'm going to want to do things a lot more wildly, and you're going to say, no, and you did that to me years ago. You're like, no, you can't say that. We can do this. And you would tell me to kind of stay within the guidelines. What are some of the trends? Are you seeing anything differently on how franchisors are using their FDD as a sales tool?
Access to the FDDs are a lot easier now than they were back in the day. Back in the day, you had to go to the state to get a copy. Now they're readily available. Our firm has a unique software program where disclosure is done online, and the franchisor doesn't have to send it out. Because in the old days, as you had to bind it, send it out. I mean, it got very expensive. Okay,
Right.
It cost a lot. Then they went. The FTC allowed electronic disclosure.
Yes.
That really changed the dynamics of disclosing people. Everybody's is allowed to do it online. They're allowed to sign online. It makes the process a lot easier and less expensive. So yeah, things have changed because of the internet and the electronic versions.
Yeah, you're right.
It's much easier.
I remember having it back in 2003, having to mail those out. There was a lot of FedExes that were going out every day.
A lot of FedExes, a lot of photocopying. You bet.
A lot of photocopying. How many sections are there in the FDD altogether?
It's 23.
Right. And is there one particular or a couple of overlooked sections that you think that are overlooked by new franchisors that they're not putting enough of an emphasis on that would help them?
Item 7 is very important. That's the investment. And you really want to make sure you have the proper range. And that's why, some of these brand new emerging brands that don't have units, it's very hard to calculate what the item 7 is. And they use a broad range, but you can get into trouble if the range is too low or too high, primarily too high. Now, the pandemic changed a lot of item 7s because things got very expensive. So franchisors had to recalibrate item 7 due to the inflation that was going rampant, 2 years ago.
Sure.
Cost of building a restaurant 2 years ago during the pandemic was way more than it was in earlier years.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to change item 7.
And item 7 also, there's one piece of it, I think, that it was critical for us that you made sure that we didn't shortchange ourselves, and that was the working capital, because every franchisor doesn't want to make it look so expensive. But how do I screw myself as the franchisor, right? Is I make the working capital amount too low. And if the franchisee has an experience where the number is too low, I can get myself in a lot of trouble.
A lot of the brokers say, wait a minute, item 7, look how high it is. The high end is too expensive. I'm saying, look, the client has to be protected. You don't know use the restaurant industry for to build a restaurant in Manhattan is going to cost you significantly more than it would if you build it in Nashville. Okay, just labor alone in New York City is ridiculous with the unions. So you've got to build in a cushion so that the franchisee is not surprised, and then it turns out to what it is. He comes with the X, and it's triple X, and I want my money back. You got to be careful. So you got to really, item 7 is a very important section. But a lot of franchisors think nothing of it. They just put numbers in.
Are there any common mistakes that you see of newer franchisors in their FDD? Item 19 aside, are there some other things that you see this as, that's a newbie, that, that's a kind of a typical mistake?
Item 6 is important. All the fees that the franchisee has to pay once they're in business. Mm-hmm. So you better make sure that you know what those fees are. Okay, because that's very important, because if all of a sudden there's a technology fee that you didn't put in my item 6, and the franchisee says, wait a minute, I'm not paying that, it wasn't in item 6, you have to eat it. So you want to make sure you put all the fees into item 6 that they're going to come up, that they're going to have to pay.
Harold, that is, I think, spot on advice, because if I recall, one of the things you had shared with me way back when is that even if I'm not doing something today, let's use a technology fee, put it in there because it's something that we may institute, but you can't call that back. Once the horse leaves the barn, you can't call it back. Yeah. So put it in there early.
It'll only work if you do that and you miss it, then it's only going to be good for people coming in after. And all the ones who are in the system are freebies.
Right. In fact, I think there was two particular things that we did this together that we didn't have in place when we first franchised. Was one, a national brand fund, but we had it in the document that we could, and we would communicate to the franchisees. We'd be like, you know what, we're going to wait till we got to X. I forgot the number. Let's say 20. We're going to wait till we get to 20 franchisees. Then we're going to start implementing the National Brand Fund because we don't want to start taking their money when, you have like one franchise, right?
Right.
And the second one was a national convention fee because we knew that was going to cost some significant dollars. And we didn't have a convention early on, but it was one of those things where we wanted to make sure it was in the document. So that's the other reason why you want to have a really experienced franchise attorney, because they see what you don't, because you've been there. You have other clients that have grown, and I don't know that.
That's right. That's right. And you're right about the convention, because if you don't have it in there and you have a convention 2 years from now and you say, well, you got to pay $450. Well, it wasn't in my FDD. I'm not paying.
I think this goes back to the importance of having really good communication with the candidate and explaining to them, here's what we have, here's why we have it in place, but we're not implementing it right away. And it takes the advice of your attorney and takes the communication with the candidate and kind of bridging that together to making sure that you're able to sell the franchise concept, and you're telling a story. That's really what the FDD is, right?
It's a book. I mean, it's basically from A to Z on what you can expect when you buy the franchise.
I've heard for years sort of two different schools of thought on this about using the FDD as a sales tool. Some people say it's not a sales tool. At best, it's neutral. And I've heard the other school of thought of saying, no, it really is a sales tool that you can use. Where do you sit on this?
As far as I'm concerned, it's still a legal document. Mm-hmm. And even with the plain language, I'm not sure how you could, a pig is a pig. You can't put lipstick on a pig. It's still going to be a pig.
Okay.
So the FDD is going to be a legal document no matter how you think it's going to be a sales document.
Right.
I don't personally think it's a sales document at all. It puts the people who read it up to sleep, okay? When you ask a franchisee, did you read the FDD? 99% of them say, no, I let my lawyer do it. So they don't even know what it says. So to think that it's actually, quote, a sales tool, I don't buy that.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fumey, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.